My name is Irma Leapart-Gooch, and I'm with the African American Alumni Association of Case Western Reserve University. I'd like to welcome you all.
Hills collapsed, so there's not enough sun.
So just to start with some housekeeping, I'm going to ask everyone to mute themselves. You'll be muted by default, but if you don't mind, please stay muted during the conversation. There will be an opportunity probably later where you can ask questions and you'll be able to unmute yourself. The African American Alumni Association officially was established in October of 2009. Our purpose is to provide support and networking opportunities to African American alumni of Case Western Reserve University. We work to provide a forum for the university to recruit students and foster friendships among persons connected with the university. During these challenging times, I hope that you and your loved ones are healthy and safe. Before we begin today's program, again, I want to repeat some housekeeping rules, that everyone is muted, and please remain muted so we can avoid some of the background noise. We know that some of you have submitted questions prior to this event, and we hope to get to those questions throughout the course of the evening. If you have any additional questions, please utilize the chat function, and we'll do our best to get to those questions before the session completes. So that we know who you are, we welcome you to rename or name yourself using the participant. You'll see that at the bottom of your screen where it says participants. Find your name and then use the more function and select rename and type in the name you'd like for us to see. We're also asking that you keep your video on. I know a lot of people like to turn them off, but if you can, please leave your video on because we'd like to have that interaction and see people's faces. I am really so happy to welcome you to this installment of the Profiles of Inclusive Excellence. It's a virtual series in collaboration with the African American Alumni Association, the Office for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity, and the African and African American Studies. And this is to highlight work and research of African American or Black alumni, and faculty. Dr. Emmitt Jolly received a Bachelor of Science degree in biology from Tuskegee University, where he was a Mark Scholar, a presidential scholar, and was honored as one of USA Today's top 40 national scholars. He earned a PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology from the University of California in San Francisco. He was trained there under the MacArthur Award recipient and National Academy of Sciences member, Dr. Ira Herskowitz. He was awarded the UCSF Chancellor's Martin Luther King Jr. Award for his leadership in diversity, as well as the UCSF Champions of Diversity Award. We have quite an accomplished presenter tonight. In addition, he and Nobel laureate J. Michael Bishop met with Senators Barbara Feinstein, Nancy Pelosi, and then Vice President Al Gore to discuss the really importance of increasing federal funding for graduate education. Their efforts were successful. Dr. Jolly was recognized in Kaleidoscope magazine's 40 Under 40, the Who's Who in Black Cleveland twice, and was awarded the Inseroma Award for Science from the National Technical Association in Cleveland, Ohio. He is a Case Western Origins Fellow, and in 2017, he was the keynote speaker for the Cleveland March for Science movement. Dr. Jolly has been the commencement speaker for both high school and other training programs. In addition, he has been nominated multiple times for the Carl Whitkey Undergraduate Teaching Award and for the J. Bruce Jackson Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Mentorship. In 2019, Dr. Jolly served as Tuskegee University's homecoming convocation speaker, and in 2020, he was named Tuskegee University Arts and Sciences Alumnus of the Year. Currently, Dr. Jolly serves as an elected member of the Shaker Heights School Board. Very important role. Dr. Jolly is the incoming chair of the Department of Biology at Case Western Reserve University, and we are so lucky to have him. And he holds the position in the Center for Global Health and Disease in the CWRU School of Medicine, so multiple roles. His NIH-funded research focuses on understanding gene expression, gene regulation, and host invasion of the parasitic schistosome worm and the causative agent of schistosomiasis. I practiced this. Schistosomiasis, which is a really horrible disease that infects way too many people. In fact, over 200 million people worldwide are infected and impacted by this really horrible disease. He serves as an editor of several scientific journals. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Emmitt Jolly.
Thank you, Irma, for that very, very kind introduction. And I just want to say thank you for the African American Alumni Association for inviting me to be here. It's such a pleasure, particularly looking at the amazing people that you had before me. And just looking at the crowd, it's nice to see some faces of people from around the country. I see an old mentor, Joel Oppenheim, my mother-in-law, Fran Collier here, Bev, and just nice to see some friendly faces. So thank you a lot, and thank you all for taking the time to listen and to be a part of this.
Thank you, Dr. Jolly. Typically, so we know that this is the profiles of inclusive excellence. And so typically it's turned over to me and you don't have to do that introduction quite, but it's great because we have such a working relationship in terms of being colleagues that you knew how to jump in and take the reins and lead the conversation to start. But we thank Irma for the great introduction of introducing you and having you to share with us this evening with our profiles of excellence. And as you said, we have had some great speakers, and I don't want to say great speakers, but great faculty and administrators within that we have featured within this profiles of excellence. And we were waiting for you to come back from sabbatical so that we could harass you as well to be a part of this, our faculty profiles of excellence. And for those of you who may not know me or who do not know me, my name is Dr. Heather Burton, and I am Senior Director for the Office of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity. And I have had the pleasure of working with Crystal Crosby, as well as my role as Acting Co-Director for the African and African American Studies minor. And so myself, Cassie Pittman-Clater, and Crystal Crosby all decided to put this faculty profiles of excellence together to feature our Black and African American faculty on our campus. And so tonight we are honored to have with us Dr. Emmitt Jolly, who we are just going to have dialogue, conversation, and just talk about you, Dr. Jolly, and talk about you in terms of some of the things that people may not know. And so we're used to hearing your scholarly research, and I'm going to touch on that very, soon. But the way that we start the profiles of excellence is I started with the movie Brown Sugar. And so I don't know if you remember the movie Brown Sugar with Taye Diggs and Sanaa Lathan, but there was a famous line in that they always asked, when did you fall in love with hip hop? And so what we do with the profiles of excellence is we kind of tweak it and we ask, when did you fall in love with your discipline? And so tonight we ask you, Dr. Jolly, when did you fall in love with biology?
I love that question, and I love the connection to that. Yes, I still love hip hop. And my daughter, Sedona, happens to be a freshman here at Case Western. And to that initial thing about hip hop, she organized a a talent show last Friday. And as part of that, she walked up and said, "Dad, could you do me a favor? Whatever you want, sweetheart." Yeah, you know, like a good dad. And she asked me to come on stage and beatbox. And so, and so I said, "What?" And I said, "Okay, fine, whatever." So they introduced me, and I went up on stage in front of Clark Hall, and I had to do a few bars and break it down for them. Old school.
And so how did that go? Do you want to give us a sample really quick before we jump into biology?
Are you serious?
I'm dead serious. I'm dead serious. This is what we do at the profile faculty.
You know,
Excellent. We learn new talents. We learned that Provost Vincent had the same experience that I've had of people walking up to him and saying, "Can I touch your hair?" So we've just learned many different things about our faculty. So yes, let's hear that hidden talent.
You know something, that hidden talent was trying to stay hidden for a while, but I guess I'm gonna be doing some beatboxing on. Okay, all right, this is new. All right, give me a sec. Yeah, I did that. Let's stop and just say Case. All right, Case Western.
That was excellent. That was like really good. I'm impressed. I started to rap with you and but then I decided that I would keep my hidden talent hidden.
You called me out and do that. But to your question, Dr. Burton, when did I fall in love with biology? I will say that my interest in biology evolved. I did not plan on going to college initially, and although I'm a preacher's kid, in many ways, a high school counselor discovered me and kind of convinced me to go to college. Her name is Mildred White, and what's important is that after that, she taught me how to play chess, she encouraged me, she mentored me, and then she did the next thing, which is introduced me to my next mentor. And that next mentor was a guy by the name of James H.M. Henderson, who had been in Tuskegee for 40 years. He was an amazing, amazing scientist. And he had me in a summer program as a high school student. And I went into that summer program after having worked in the cotton fields for 2 years before that. And he asked me what I wanted to do, and I said genetics, because I just had my first biology class and I liked genetics. And so he put me into a laboratory doing cytogenetics, which is the study of the cell, genetics of the cell, which included studying how chromosomes divide, et cetera. And so I got into that lab and I learned a lot. I was successful in that summer program. And shortly after that, I was working on a NASA seeds project, looking at tomatoes that had been in space for 6 years. And from that moment, it's been all biology.
And so you were one of those people who knew exactly what you wanted to do from a young age.
You know, I'd say there was a transformation that happened. And so I was raised very blue collar. So overhauling cars, doing roofing, I worked in janitorial. And so I was being groomed very blue collar, but with a very strong faith base. And after this counselor in many ways changed my life to shift from blue collar to white collar in a way that I never expected. And I can tell you exactly the moment when it happened. She called me in and she said I had high math scores. And it was on chicken day, I can tell you, in the lunchroom. Back then, you know, the cafeteria, they have chicken day and fish day and all these other things. This is chicken day. And she called me from the cafeteria to her office, and I was so upset. And it happened twice. The first time, she just said, you know, "You got great scores, thank you." The second year, she called me, and then she asked what I want to do. And I said, "I'll be a janitor or an electrician." And she basically said, "Well, you know, have you considered becoming an electrical engineer?" And what I didn't want to tell her was, "Lady, do you realize that I am broke? College is not an option." And eventually I did, and she told me about scholarships and basically said that if you do well, that you could get a scholarship and they'll pay for college. And after that moment, she showed me some, at the time, salary books that showed me the difference between an electrician and an electrical engineer. And I decided I wanted to be an electrical engineer after that. And so at that moment, I started moving toward a collegiate, the idea that I would go to college and be a white collar worker. And so it really just transformed things after that.
And I know yesterday we briefly talked about service, and we're discussing service, especially when you talk about underrepresented minorities, specifically when we're talking about Black faculty and the aspect of mentoring. And I know mentoring is a great part of who you are. And so from undergrad to graduate, even, professional. And so in that, when you think about the experience that you had with this particular counselor, what is it that connects, or even what is it that connected you to that particular counselor and the mentoring, and what is it that connects you to students to make that such a priority?
That's a multifactorial question in many ways. The first thing is that here's someone who saw something in me that I did not see in myself. And then at the same time was willing to take the time and to spend the time with me to help support me, so that eventually I began to believe in myself in a way that I didn't before. And often, if you think about what mentoring is, often people simply need guidance to help get to the point where the capabilities will allow them. And so, because in many ways she took me and really transformed my life, I think in much the same way George Washington Carver was, what I was given, I also have to give. And so I find it critically important to create the same types of opportunities for students that I got, and to help them sometimes get over themselves in order to really be successful. And that really excites me.
Yeah. And I think about, I always think about, and think about W.E. Du Bois and the aspect of the talented TIF. It's once you receive that education and once you get to a point, we have a commitment to an obligation. And we also talked about this yesterday, is that's the way that we move the Black community forward. If we don't mentor, if we don't help, if we don't provide service, then the community doesn't move forward. And so I'm thinking about that because I want to hear more about this March for Science, and where you were the keynote speaker. What is the March for Science?
So the March. So first, I'll answer another question and then come back to the March for Science. And what you described in terms of mentoring really becomes, I had to hold somebody's hand and they pulled me up. And it is my job to take the other hand so that I can pull someone else up. And so building this chain where we keep the community growing. The March for Science was really a protest in many ways about the lack of the use for science during the last administration, and to really, in some ways, talk about the importance for science in policy and the importance for thinking about science when we start making various decisions. It was a time right around the same time there was the Women's March that happened, and it was a significant and important march that happened in Washington, D.C. My understanding is that Cleveland had about 15,000 people there at the March for Science, and I was just pleased to be able to say some words that help to motivate people and continue to inspire people to use science as a platform, to be able to as a platform for thinking about policy and for thinking about how we want to move forward in a very practical and scientific way.
I was thinking also, and there's so many questions that I want to ask you, because I know some of the things that you do on campus, I know the things you're involved. And what I did forget to do was congratulate you on your upcoming appointment as chair for the Department of Biology. And we are so glad to have you in that position. And I know that you are going to do great work, and especially when it comes to that department, as well as the recruitment, retention of underrepresented faculty, staff, and students within that department. So I am really excited. I know from your bio, working with graduate students and increasing the number of underrepresented students, specifically in STEM and programs. And then we heard in the bio about your meeting with, I forgot which president.
That was Vice President Al Gore.
Yes, I couldn't remember in my mind. But I know that you and I have worked together on the NOAA AGAP grant and done work together when it comes to graduate students. What is it that you think, what is it about that population that needs the assistance versus other populations, even when we're talking about underrepresented minorities, as well as when we're talking about that graduate school population?
You know, it's particularly graduate students in science. It's a culture, and often people don't necessarily understand the culture. It is not necessarily about taking classes. It is about discovery. And so there is no guarantee that you will discover something. So you take classes, your first year or two, depending on your program, your PhD program, and you may get perfect straight A's in those classes. But the rest of your time is really trying to discover and create and discover and understand something new about science that no one else in the world knows. This is an exciting thing to do, but it is not necessarily easy. These students are not allowed to have jobs. They receive a stipend to take care of their daily, for daily requirements, et cetera. That stipend is not large. And so they spend large amounts of time working in the laboratory, trying to discover and understand how cells work or how things work in ecology. And they and it requires a lot of effort and time. When I was a graduate student, I worked 12 to 16 hours a day. And this was for 6 to almost 7 days, depending on which time period we're talking about. And so they spend a lot of time, and in many ways, you live in the laboratory to do this. And so this population now, what we often see is that if things are not working, now, if you do well in class, just think about the scenario. You get all A's in your classes, and then you struggle for the next 3 years trying to understand some question. When you walked in saying, I want to cure science, cure cancer, and you walk out saying, I want to I just want to show that these two proteins interact with each other. The challenge is there, and often this group needs motivation, they need support, and sometimes just reminding them, why did you start this in the first place? And so the third, fourth year is always hard. And as they get over that hump, this is when often the way that they think shifts dramatically. And part of the PhD is not necessarily just discovering something, but really learning how to ask a question properly. And so they transform from people interested in science to scientists who are asking challenging and intelligent questions, and then finding ways to solve them. So I think it's challenging to do this, but it's just so rewarding when you see them overcome the difficulties and be successful.
Yeah, and I always tell students that getting a PhD is like pledging a sorority or fraternity, and you're being hazed, but you have no idea that you're being hazed. And so, and with that, we worked with several students, several of the same students, and I remember watching you with one student in particular, and with this conversation around biology, and both of us trying to help the student to stay in the PhD program and not opt out for a master's. And so just watching your level of care in regards to that student and the progress of that student and what what we were looking for them to be able to achieve. But in that, I also watched your passion for biology and your love for biology, which we all know that I am a liberal arts student, and I love the arts and anything that's creative that will take my mind. And jokingly, I'll share with the audience, if you see that couch in the background of Dr. Jolly, as Dr. Jolly and this student were having this great conversation that they were engaging in biology, I was asleep on the couch. But needless to say, in that, your passion around biology, I want to talk about your research in understanding gene expansion. And for those of us who are not familiar with the terms, Tell us, what does this mean in layman's term? So give us an understanding.
So the first thing I'll say is, you notice that Dr. Burton said that she was asleep on my couch, which tells you that apparently it wasn't interesting enough for her to stay awake. But that being said,
well, let me rephrase now. That's because the conversation that you and the student had went for 2 hours. It was a 2-hour conversation. So by that, once we were like 45 minutes in, I'm like, is this going to end? And I couldn't leave the student. So I just took a little nap.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think it was only supposed to be a 45-minute to an hour meeting.
Yes.
What I work on, and my research has shifted over time. And right now, the work that I do is studying a parasitic worm called schistosomiasis. Called schistosoma mannsoni, or schistosomes, that cause a disease called schistosomiasis. You get it when you go to certain countries, and in those countries you go into the water. Inside the water are snails that have been infected by this parasite. And don't get me wrong, the snails do not want to be infected either. But they're infected by this parasite, and the parasite exits out of the snails, and they're attracted to human skin. And as you wade in the water, they bind to your skin, and then they produce enzymes that degrade human tissue. So there's an enzyme called elastase, which, if you look at your face, is all flexible and stuff. Well, there's a protein called elastin that's responsible for that. They break that down and then enter into your skin. They lose their tails and eventually go through the circulatory system, entering to the mesentery of your liver, and this is where they mature into adult male and female worms. They may produce 300 to 1,000 eggs per day that come out of your urine or feces, depending on what species of worm it is. Those eggs have about 6 hours to find now a snail host that can no longer infect humans. They have 6 hours to find a snail host. They go into the snail's liver/pancreas component called hepatopancreas. And then this is where they produce the cercaria, or this larva that now can infect people. What we do is, one is trying to understand what's necessary for the development of these parasites in the human body. So this cercaria, what is going on inside the snail is it gets developed. And then the cercaria, that larva itself that's infectious, how does it develop? And what are the necessary factors necessary for it to infect and invade the human system in order to continue to develop it? In terms of words, I am a biochemist, geneticist, molecular biologist who studies parasites. And I want to use those skills to understand the genes that are necessary and involved to control the development of these parasites, and then look at identifying drugs that target some of these genes so that we can help to treat schistosomiasis and the possibility of a prophylactic to block invasion and infection.
So in other words, you're just smart.
I talk a good game.
So here's the test for the audience. Who can repeat what Dr. Jolly just said? No, I'm just kidding. But in that, Dr. Jolly, when you're thinking about students that you recruit for your lab, are you looking for students that have that same research interest, or how do you find students for your lab? I mean, do they call and say, I'm interested in gene expansion? I'm not going to try like Irma to try even pronounce right, like the schistosomiasis. Did I said it right though?
Schistosomiasis. Well, so when I said that my what I study shifts, I wasn't very specific, but at one point, one of my research with a lady named Erin O'Shea was trying to understand how genes are turned on and turned off. From there, my graduate work was to understand how one protein can turn on and off a whole series of other genes. And then for my postdoc, I shifted organisms to kind of understand what are the genes turned on and off during development of the different life stages of schistosomes. And now my focus is to understand what specific proteins, and not only what genes are turned on, but what proteins are turned on and off in order to help in the development. what I love is when I get emails from students, and I'm slow on email replying. I will just tell you, you know this, but I love when they come back and they send me an email. They're interested in doing some research often. I was excited this last 2 weeks. I got an email from a high school student from California who's saying, I read your stuff and now I'm interested in, I'd love to join your lab. So we're trying to work out a way so he can remotely work, doing work with the lab during the summer. So, and undergrad, I get excited when they are interested, but what do I look for? I look for drive. I know people often like to look at students' GPAs and say, well, do you have the grades? Do you have this? In my opinion, students who come to my lab, my job is to teach you how to think. But I want you to also understand that this is not easy. And so anything that you work hard for, you enjoy more. You may hate it, but you enjoy more, you benefit more, which is the idea of don't give me something, don't give them a fish, but teach him or her how to fish. And so my job is to teach them how to think, but they need grit initially. And what I'm looking for in my interview, when I start talking to them, is understanding what their drive is. And if they have drive, I can work with drive and then move them to where they need to be in terms of thinking about a problem. So I love driven students. I love students who are hungry. And you can have a bright person who just doesn't want to work. That doesn't work. But a person who's hungry, those are the kind of students I love to have.
And with that, thinking about when you were a student, how did you pick this research focus?
You mean in terms of
starting out even as undergrad with schistosomiasis, with gene expansion, with genes, did you just wake up and say, "Ooh, I think I want to study genes today"?
I will say that it has been an evolution. I started off first just learning about biology in a summer program under Dr. Williams that was coordinated by Dr. Henderson. And it expanded my mind in a way. I mean, for the first time, I can tell you, I joined the lab and I had to ask a simple question because on day one, Dr. Williams gave me a master's thesis and said, here, I want you to go read this. Now, I'd worked as a janitor. I'd worked in the cotton field for 2 years. For me, you work to get paid. And so he asked me to read. And I said, am I going to get paid for this? And he's like, yeah, why wouldn't you? I said, so I'm going to get paid to learn. And that was it. I mean, the fact that I can sit there and expand my mind, read some theses sitting in an air-conditioned place, not in the field, air-conditioned place reading and get paid for it, I was good from that moment on. And so it just progressed from cytogenetics to molecular biology to doing biochemistry to doing more genetics. And so each time I was expanding my base and learning more things to the point where I could start thinking about other questions, and particularly questions that affected people like me. So when I finished my background in doing genetics and biochemistry as a graduate student, the real question was, what am I going to do with these skills that I have? And I chose to work initially on African sleeping sickness and then on schistosomiasis. At the time, they were number 2. African sleeping sickness was one of the 3rd most important neglected diseases. Schistosomiasis, number 2, malaria, number 1. And the idea was to take these expertise that I have to work on something that there weren't, a lot of people were doing malaria, a lot of people were doing cancer, a lot of people were doing HIV, but there weren't as many people taking their expertise and investing in some of these neglected diseases. And more importantly, these are the diseases that affect people of color and people in poverty. And I have a soft spot for both of them.
Yes, and I'm just, every time you say about you working in the cotton field, I'll probably be holding that against you for the rest of our careers. But with that experience, and I'm just thinking about just knowing part of your story, is when you think about that, here you are, someone who was working in the cotton fields, went to Tuskegee, and then from Tuskegee, you transitioned to a predominantly white institution. What was that transition like? especially, we're talking about just you being interested in working with people of color, you being interested in working with those that are economically disadvantaged. And so in that, what was it like to have that experience to transfer from Tuskegee to a predominantly white institution?
It was the most shocking experience I'd ever had. So when I loved the Tuskegee. Everyone looked like me. When I left there, I was living in Booker T. Washington's daughter's house, and we paid $450 for the three of us to rent the place. And then I moved to San Francisco, and I'd been there the summer before, but I was trying to find a place. And to be quite honest, my parents, I had never told my parents this, but I left Tuskegee on a plane with my 2 bags. And at the time, my girlfriend, who I later married, was a medical student at Stanford, Stacy. And I got to San Francisco, and I remember just before I left, I was there for the summer looking for a place. I went to a showing for a house. And when I say showing, it was a showing from 12 to 1. It was a dump. It was $1,600 for a room. And there were 50 people there. And they had first month, last month, deposit, and bribing money. And I have never had this kind of money all at once anywhere. And so I didn't have a place to go when I landed in San Francisco. So let's start there. And my girlfriend at the time, they had a retreat with the med school. And so she gave me her car so that I could get around. And the truth is I had nowhere to go. And my intention was I was going to sleep in Golden Gate Park in her car that first night. It just so happened that there was a professor who, interesting, I wrote him last year to thank him. I'd never met. He had a house that was there, and he heard that there was a student who didn't have a place. And he said that if I took care of his plants, that I could stay there until I found a place. Now, having been the person who took care of the Tuskegee biology greenhouse, taking care of plants was my thing. I was happy so I stayed at this guy's house, and in the end never was homeless. Found a place the next week. That being said, the shift, not only financially, but also socially, was a shock. I mean, I could not have chosen a more distinct place to go to, going from a conservative Southern town with, Tuskegee, it's known as this all Black Mecca, to San Francisco, which is known to be diverse. But in reality, I was the only person who looked like me in my department and the first Black person to be in my program. And it was difficult. People would say things that, people were nice. People said things that they didn't necessarily think were bad. So for example, there was one guy, he was trying to be nice, and he would come up to me and say, I'm trying to grow an afro, but Emmitt, I can't get my hair as kinky as yours. And it would happen. And at a certain point I said, you might not want to ever call a Black person's hair kinky, ever. And so there were these little things. And you can talk about microaggressions. Sometimes the question what I had to really learn, because at first I was angry for a few things that were going on. But then I learned that often it was simply people didn't understand. There was no dialogue. And so I started talking to a handful of people. Proposition 209 had passed at that time. So this was the one that made affirmative action illegal. And then I think during that same time, they had another proposition that made marijuana legal in the same election, in the same voting election. And so I learned something, which was that there were people who didn't look like me, who were committed and concerned about diversity. And so this was a shock because, one, in Alabama, and I hate to be long-winded on this, I hate to say it, but we were told very early on, do not go drinking with white people. because there's so many scenarios where you go out and they, go drinking and somebody does something and you're the black guy, you go to jail, everyone else gets off. Or you get killed and everyone goes away and nothing happens except you're just in a bad situation. So I started graduate school. And in graduate school, the first thing that happened is they wanted to have a journal club or study for whatever, the whole class. And the first place they had it was at a pizza place over beer. And I got to tell you, I was freaking out because I am now going to go with my non-Black classmates into a bar/pizza joint, and we're going to be drinking beer, and I'm going to get arrested. I just know. And so there were these things that I had to, that for survival in one place were ideal, but I had to change how I thought about this in San Francisco. And I learned a lot in terms of how that many of us are different, but a lot of it is simply that we don't communicate enough. And particularly when it comes to DEI stuff, which wasn't the term then, but particularly when it comes to DEI stuff, that often the dialogue is the most important thing. And it got to the point where people would say things that are out of the way, and they would say, Emmitt, did you notice that? And I say, yeah. Well, why don't you say something? If I say something, unless this is done the right way, we're going to have a fight and they won't learn anything from it. And the most important thing, if something's going to happen, if you're going to make change, is to make it a learning experience. And it got to the point where instead of me fighting issues of diversity, equity, and equal treatment, other people who didn't look like me were the ones standing up to say, this is not fair, you should do so and so. And it is those things that really, I think, helped me to begin to build this cohort of people who were supportive, even though there were another group of people that weren't. So, and of course, I started recruiting other people that look like me, big time.
Right, which is the work that we do. And I think you said something. I remember a mentor told me, she said, you use every moment as a teaching moment, and in everything, whether it's with students or whether it's with your colleagues, but you use every moment as a teaching moment. And I think that has been the thing that I have actually learned in doing diversity and inclusion work. Because when I started in this work, I was an undergrad. And so my first job was in Minority Affairs and then the Black Cultural Center. So when you go from the Black Cultural Center to diversity and inclusion, it's a completely different, a different realm of work. And so, you learn different things and you learn how to navigate space. And I think that's, one of the things that we've talked about is creating this space for particularly our graduate students who come from HBCUs to Case Western Reserve, and offering the stories that our faculty and staff who have come from HBCUs as mentoring stories to work with them. The next question, I see, Arnold, do you have a hand up?
Yeah, I do actually. So the derivative question is always, what were your first impressions as a lowly assistant professor coming to beautiful downtown Cleveland and interacting in an arena that we thought we were making inroads with regard to diversity, not by hiring you, but originally by hiring Hainsworth and others, and of course Cleveland ain't San Francisco. So it'd be interesting to know what your feelings, comfort level was when you came to Case, those first few months, which were complicated.
Arnold, are you trying to set me up? By the way, Arnold Kaplan, in the end, ended up being my faculty advisor in biology. So I have a lot of respect for him, which is why I asked him, is he trying to set me up? I will say that when I moved here, I thought that Cleveland was 10 years behind in a couple of different things. And the DEI stuff was, I think we were not really thinking about things from the perspective of the individual. What I've really appreciated is since I've been here, I've begun to watch a transformation, and particularly right now, watching, they had Mayor Mobley, right now having Heather and why am I going blank on
VP Solomon, Robert Solomon.
Robert Solomon, and the provost, you know, and of course the dean that we have now. I mean, the dean of arts and sciences, Joy, is doing some amazing, aggressive things. And so what I appreciate is, I think that there was a lot desired when I moved here, and I'm watching a real transformation initiating at the university that I can actually say now I'm proud to be a part of. So that's the answer to your trick question. But I know it was a serious question, so thank you for that, Arnold.
And it's interesting that Arnold actually asked that question, because one of the questions that I was going to ask you as well is, what are some of your biggest challenges with being a Black male, specifically in the STEM fields, when you think about that, because you are one of few? You know,
isolation is always a challenge, but I have always been a little bit aggressive. And it's funny because I'm looking at the audience here, and I want to highlight Joel Oppenheim for this in particular. Joel was recruiting me for a summer program at NYU. He was the associate dean of medicine there, and wanted me to go to a summer program, and I went to San Francisco instead. But I got to know him well because he came to Tuskegee recruiting, and I saw him at Abercrombie's every year. So he was a face of that. I mean, he's probably recruited and built more minorities than I don't think I ever will be able to do in terms of impact. But this story becomes important because I was at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories, which was run by Watson, as in Watson and Crick, and Joe's laughing. And while I was there, a postdoc pulled me to the side, and there's this library in there where they have all of these famous scientists' pictures in the library. And there's pencil-drawn pictures by some artists that they have. And so the postdoc said, "Did you notice all the pictures in the library?" I said, "Yeah." "Did you notice that none of them were Black?" I said, "Oh, yeah." And he said, "Well, I just want you to know that it's because Watson said that he couldn't find any good Black scientists." I said, "He couldn't find any good Black scientists?" And I started naming Black scientists that I knew. It's like, well, there's John Watson at UCSF. There's Jimmy Henderson. And I just started going down the list. And then I said, hold it. I'm a good Black scientist. And from there was a bet. Now, I knew one person in New York City, 8 million people that I know in New York. I knew one person out of 8 million. At the time, me and my wife to be later on went to the city, and I was going to go downtown to find a park. And I heard there was a park where they drew pictures, kind of like the big decent sized picture. And I was going to have my picture drawn and put it dead center in that library. And so I went to New York. I didn't know where I was going. And on the street, we run into the one person in New York City that I know, Joel Oppenheim, who then we tell him what we're doing. He cracks up, tells us where the park was. We go there, I get my picture. I look like a criminal in the drawing. We go back to Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories. I put my picture in the very front pillar to make sure you could not miss it. And it was there. And then they had these large meetings, and everyone would walk in and they would see my picture there with my birth date and until whatever. And so they would stop me. "What did you discover?" And the truth is, I was working on RNA alternative splicing, which is how you can use one gene to make multiple gene products or multiple proteins. And I had found some new proteins. So I just said, I didn't really do much. I just identified some new, proteins associated with RNA alternative splicing. And so they thought I was being modest, but the reality is that's what I was doing. Eventually, Watson found out about it. And the next thing I know is the picture ended up back in my lab with a note that said he got it. And so in some ways, it's these little things that you can do to make an impact. As you said, that when you teach lessons without it necessarily being an aggressive type mean thing, but little things to teach lessons. One of the challenges, I'd say, for many people may simply be isolation. The worry that you're not good enough sometimes, depending on your background. I went to Tuskegee. I think I'm good enough for everything. But that being said, I still run into situations where I go, well, I need to work a little harder on this because I don't want to appear a certain way. And you walk into a place where you're the one guy. where everybody knows when they try to describe you, they in the end they say the black guy, because that's you. And the question is, how comfortable are you being the black guy? And if you're not successful, if you don't do well, the pressure is that you represent your whole race, and you're the black guy or the black lady who's just not that good. And those are the things that I fought hard against to make sure that I was good enough, to make sure that I was working hard enough to try to be the best. And sometimes you succeed, sometimes you don't. But success, the only way you succeed is through failure. And I learn every time I fail and every time I make a mistake. So.
Yeah, I love that. And especially, you know, the part of talking with that when you're the black guy or the black girl or the black woman or the black person, is that when you do good, you're the individual. But when you do bad, you represent the whole community. And so it's always that individual versus the systems. And I will shout out that my soror is on the call this evening, who is also a Tuskegee alum. And so Beverly, just raise your hand. So, Beverly is also a Tuskegee alum. But
well, I know.
there's a question. Yes, I didn't know that. She just told me tonight. But there's a question in the chat for you. And I do want to point out that James, I don't want to say your last name wrong. I think it's Shattinger. Did I say it right? James just wanted to say that he was impressed with you, Dr. Jolly, from the first time he met when you were running for a seat on the Shaker School Board. But tonight he's even more impressed. That's because I'm only bringing out the good things, James. I'm only bringing out the good things. But no, for real, there's a question from the chat that says, can you comment on how you prepare students of color for their professional careers and the challenges they may face in both academia or the corporate world?
I think that's pretty straightforward. I'm honest. I don't color code anything. I make sure that they understand the world that they are going into. I work to make sure they are prepared. Preparation is critical. If you're not prepared, you're not going to be successful. And being very straightforward of what is needed to be successful. How does it feel when you're the one? And so I provide opportunities to make sure that they are in front, speaking and talking, interacting with other speakers, where they now begin to develop a relationship with people that don't necessarily look like them, and try to build cohorts around themselves. And so it's great when you have at least 7 people who look like you, who you can interact with, and you can shoot the breeze and be real with, but everyone's not that lucky. And so sometimes you have to find people who don't look like you, who will be willing to support you and stand up for you. And then, I'm honest. I have the conversation. I talk about the difficulties I had being scooped and having to start over with graduate school completely from scratch my 4th year. I talk about the challenges associated with this. And, I also talk about the things where people kind of messed you over, and just be honest and then help them. It's like if there's an ocean that you have to cross, no one tells you, they tell you, wow, it's going to be great when you get over there, but no one tells you there's an ocean. You don't know that you need to build a boat. And so it's important to make sure they know the challenges so that they can get the tools to prepare them to be able to move forward. And I think I did, there's another person here I want to recognize, Rush Shervania. Thank you for coming, Rush. Rush, interestingly, was the Grand Master of Freemasons of California several years ago. So now he's a past Grand Master. So thanks for coming.
Sorry I was late, but I'm thrilled to hear what I have had the chance to. My love to Stacy and the kids.
I will pass it on. Thanks.
So there's another question I'll take from the chat, and then I'll wrap up with a few questions because our time is drawing near. But was there something or someone from early childhood that you would attribute your success to? I know we talked about your counselor from high school, but what about anyone earlier than that?
My parents, hands down, my parents were strong. They made sure that I was a person of faith. They made sure they were strict disciplinarians. And I mean, when I say strict, I mean strict disciplinarians, where you might, for every consequence, there's an equal and maybe more equal response. And so I understood that what I did, whatever action I did had a consequence, good or bad. There was a strong work ethic. Not only did we have to cut our grass, but we were told to go and cut the old lady's grass next door because her grass needed to be cut. And so we would have to cut people's grass in the neighborhood. And so you care about the people in your community. And so my dad, although he never went to college, was always reading. My mother was doing the same thing. And so we just had to learn all of these different, you just learn how to do things. The car breaks down. And I can tell you, I was driving to school one day, my brother and I, and the transmission fell out of the car while we were driving 20 miles to school. We had a hydraulic jack in the back. We had all the tools. We went back, picked up the transmission, put it back in the car, jacked up the car, put it together, drove to school. And so these are the tools that you learn, where you have to be intuitive, where you have to be willing to learn new things and deal with each challenge as it comes. And so having support, having my parents teach me without any question that you have to be self-sufficient, that you have to, they were preparing me to be independent when I was very young. I think that made a big difference. And I know very clearly that although it took a long time before they would say, I love you, I knew by action that they really cared about me. And so a strong male influence, a strong mother was really important. And I know a lot of people don't have the opportunity to have a strong father in their lives, and I did.
What is it that you enjoy most about your job?
You know, first of all, there's a lot of freedom because I like to learn new things. And so the most recent thing when I moved to Cleveland, I learned how to snowboard. And most recently, I've just learned how to golf with some friends here. And so I'm learning new things, and I have the freedom as an academic to be able to do that. So I can work. I can come in when I need to, teach my courses. I can work in the lab from 9 o'clock to 11 p.m. or work in my lab from 3 p.m. to 3 a.m. It's flexibility. And so having that flexibility, being able to interact with students who are excited, and at the same time, this is the thing, training students and discovering new things. You know, every day there's something. Some days are just boring and you go through it and you fail and it sucks. But then there are those highs. You discover something and you see something no one else in the world has seen before. And you're experiencing that with a student who doesn't know what to do. And the truth is, you don't know what to do either. And together you develop a plan to try to understand these observations. And so this is exciting. And watching other people grow around me, because if I'm just doing well, but no one's doing well around me, I haven't succeeded. The reality is you succeed when you can bring the whole group up together. And then when you leave, you see what's left behind, that there's a product and a culture, and you see other people's success. And that's what I enjoy.
What advice would you give to young people to get them to consider a STEM career?
I think, first of all, STEM is so important. For me, I think STEM should be used as a platform to do whatever. And I say that in this way because often people assume that if I'm going to do a degree in STEM, that I must now work in a laboratory and do X, Y, and Z. And the truth is that's not necessarily the case. For example, we need more people who have science backgrounds or mathematical backgrounds, technology backgrounds, who are in politics, who can now think about things in a different way from a scientific perspective and address problems very, very differently. We need people, think about who's the person who's supposed to make science simple to the general population, your scientific writers. They have to be able we need to have people who can do very broad things. And in addition to that, I mean, who writes the intellectual property stuff? So now you have science background people who go into law, biotechnology, science people with business degrees. And so science, I think, becomes a good platform to do so many other things that we need in society. And so because of that, I encourage students to use that as a backbone, because there's so many other things that you can do with it.
Yeah, I was talking to Craig Nard from the law school, and we were talking about, and I, Beverly and Emmitt, I put Tuskegee on the map with Craig in terms of recruiting engineering students to become patent lawyers, and what they can make compared to just a few months program as a patent lawyer versus going directly into engineering. So I did connect him, and I told him to reach out to you too. But this is our last question, or my last question for this evening for you, Dr. Jolly, is we've talked about inside the institution and the things that you love inside of the institution and the things that you are committed to and the work that you do, which is phenomenal. And you have touched so many students and so many individuals on Case's campus, as well as not only just on Case's campus, but throughout the country in terms of the work that you do and the mentoring that you do. And so with that, what are your favorite things to do outside of Case Western Reserve University and in the city of Cleveland?
Okay, all right. So I will tell you, my favorite things have shifted. It used to be basketball, hands down. And it got to the point where I can't find people my age to play basketball with. So basketball had to go by the wayside. I love wintertime snowboarding. Love snowboarding. Once I learned how to snowboard, I tell you, I spent a lot of time with a soft behind. But I learned how to snowboard, and now I love doing black diamonds on the snowboard. During the summer, the last 5 years, I've taken up golf, and I'm enjoying the game in a way that I laughed at people who play golf, and now I'm golfing. And I got to tell you, I've adjusted to Cleveland. Cleveland with the metro parks. I mean, there's a park right across from my house with opportunity to go on different lakes. We've rented boats and gone down, done a lot of outdoors things. And so these are the things I'm starting to enjoy and trying to appreciate. I mean, if you don't, my whole thing is I like to do things I like to do. I enjoy science. I don't believe in working yourself to death, but I believe in work hard and then play hard. And so I am trying to build friends, build relationships, because in the end, my philosophy is invest in people, not in things, and just enjoying life as much as I can. So.
Is there anything else that you would like to add that I have not asked you that you want to share with our audience tonight?
I'll tell you something that I do that a lot of people don't know that I do. But first, I want to thank my wife and kids and for supporting me. That a lot of times that often goes understated, how important it is to have family support, and kids who actually still like you. My mother-in-law's here supporting me, Fran, and so these are really important. And having advisors who still stay in touch. Another thing I learned to do while I was here is I learned to quilt. And so now every now and then I'll go and make a quilt just because my father had this thing, you need to be able to do everything just in case you're alone. So I learned how to cook and sew and all of those things. And quilting became this kind of new thing that I just learned to do. And I build things like storage houses and things. I like to learn new things. Plain and simple.
So you can actually go pick your own cotton and stuff your quilt. Resist. I'm sorry. Just could not resist on that one, Dr. Jolly. Oh my goodness, sorry. But I thank you. You knew it was coming. You knew that it was going to come at some point. But I thank you for sharing with us this evening and taking time out of your schedule to be a part of our Profiles of Inclusive Excellence. And I thank everyone for listening tonight. This has been refreshing, and to hear your story from, different angles and to see people on the screen that are supporting you and that have supported you your entire career. And, I've had the pleasure of meeting your wife and kids, and I know that they support you. And hi, mother-in-law, welcome. And so we just thank you all, and we thank you all for joining. And on behalf of the Office of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity, the African and African American Studies minor, and the African Alumni Association, we thank you for being a part. And I will now turn it over to Crystal or Irma to close us out and give our future announcements.
Thank you. Wow, this was phenomenal. So thank you everyone for joining us, and a special thank you to you, Dr. Jolly, for all that you've shared with us. I think we're all the better for it. And thank you to the Office of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity. Heather, it was a pleasure hearing you, meeting you, and your questions were super. Join us for our next profile in inclusive excellence. It will be in May. I think Crystal put an announcement in the chat, but it will feature Vice President for the Office of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity, Robert Solomon, Esquire. If you're interested in more information about the African American Alumni Association at Case Western Reserve University, you can follow us on Facebook under African American Alumni Association, CWRU, AAAA, African American Alumni Association. And we'd love to engage with you more. Thank you so much, everyone.